Imagine waking up in the Middle Ages with a fever and a cough. What do? Call the doctor? Well, your doctor is probably a guy who thinks bleeding you with leeches is the cure for everything. That's right, medieval medicine wasn't so much about fixing you. It was about guessing what might make you feel better. So, grab your trusty wooden spoon, and let's dive into the world where herbal potions, rat poison, and magic spells were the best forms of medical care. Welcome to History Lullaby. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can keep exploring history's quirkiest and most absurd moments. Today, we're taking a somewhat pleasant journey through the world of medieval medicine, where there was no such thing as sanitation. Medical textbooks were more like fantasy novels, and your doctor might just offer you a prayer and some chicken soup, or, a good old-fashioned beheading. Doctors in the Middle Ages weren't exactly what you'd expect. In fact, calling them doctors is a bit of a stretch. The medical profession back then was more about confidence than competence. Forget about fancy degrees or sterile environments. No, the medieval doctor's toolkit mostly consisted of a few questionable herbs, a lot of guesswork, and perhaps a book or two written by some ancient Greek or Roman guy who didn't know any better. These so-called doctors were usually untrained men who thought that reading a few texts from antiquity made them experts in the art of healing. So, when you went to see one of them, you might be treated by anyone, from a local barber. Yes, a barber. We'll get into that in a minute. To a traveling quack who promised to cure everything from your pesky cold to the plague. All for a reasonable price, of course. If you were a peasant living in the countryside, your doctor might have been a guy who was more familiar with sharpening knives than setting bones. If you were lucky enough to live in a town, you might have had access to someone who at least pretended to know something about medicine. However, most people probably didn't even know if they were getting actual treatment or just some sketchy potion that may or may not have been just a mix of water and snake oil. For many, their medical care could involve some oddball remedies, like being told to rub a dead rat on your skin to cure an infection. Yeah, you read that right. The truth is, medieval doctors didn't exactly have a firm grasp on anatomy, hygiene, or basic biology. Forget about hygiene. Clean water was a luxury. These doctors probably didn't wash their hands before performing surgery, let alone sterilize their tools. No, they simply relied on what we'd now call trial and error. But in their world, the error often meant death. And guess what? The more errors they made, the more innovative their cures became. But hey, if you survived a medieval doctor's treatment, you probably felt pretty invincible. If you didn't die of the procedure, at least you might survive the plague, or whatever the latest disease was. Doctors in the medieval period were often nothing more than optimistic hobbyists who just didn't know what they were doing. It's not like they had a proper medical school to attend, no professors or lecture halls to teach them how to deal with the human body. Instead, a lot of their knowledge came from ancient texts, some of which were written thousands of years earlier by people who had no idea that germs even existed. So it's no surprise that many of the treatments they recommended did more harm than good. Picture this. You're in the middle of an outbreak of some horrendous disease, and the doctor comes in, looks at your symptoms, and says, I think it's best we drain a lot of your blood to let the bad humors out. Yeah, sounds like a solid plan, right? At least, medieval doctors had one thing going for them. They were pretty creative. But creative doesn't always mean effective. Take a barber surgeon, for instance. Yes, in the Middle Ages, barbers weren't just about cutting hair. They were also responsible for surgery. Imagine trusting someone to perform surgery who might have only learned how to set a broken bone after accidentally breaking their own leg. These guys had no formal training in medicine, so they'd learn their craft by, doing it. If you were lucky enough, your barber surgeon might have known how to stitch up a wound, but if you were unlucky, you could end up with an infection, or worse. These barber surgeons were basically the medieval equivalent of the enthusiastic but poorly trained hobbyists. And then there were the traveling quacks, who wandered from town to town selling magical potions, healing elixirs, and miracle cures. These guys were the true medieval equivalent of the snake oil salesman, except they didn't have a slick pitch and a flashy coat. They'd show up at markets, fairs, and festivals, promising to cure anything from baldness to the plague. And if you were desperate enough, you'd hand over your hard-earned money to these charming con artists. These quacks didn't have a single clue about actual medicine, but they had charisma, and that was often all they needed to get by. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was a bit behind the times, so much so that even the nobility often had no clue what was actually going on inside their bodies. So when you called for a doctor, you might not even get one trained in real science. You could end up with someone who had read a book about leeching, which, let's face it, wasn't all that helpful, or a priest who thought praying would cure your wounds. But hey, at least you felt cared for, even if the solution was a mixture of wine and crushed up gems. Imagine trying to get a simple tooth extraction done and having a doctor show up with a pair of pliers and some, confidence. You'd probably wish you'd never eaten that extra chunk of bread. Oh, and let's not forget the medical tools these doctors used. Rusty knives, wooden planks, and any other object they thought might help them fix what was going on inside your body. Sure, they might have seen the human body in action, but knowing how it works? Not so much. So, when it came to choosing a doctor, medieval peasants had it tough. If you were wealthy enough to afford a real physician, and by real we mean someone who'd at least heard of Hippocrates, you were in luck. But if you were just an average peasant trying to get through a small infection, good luck finding someone who knew the difference between a cold and the plague. It wasn't uncommon for the poor to die under the hands of doctors who had no idea what they were doing. In fact, if you didn't die from the disease, there was a good chance you'd meet your maker at the hands of a doctor wielding something they learned from a scroll of ancient knowledge. That was probably not all that helpful. You get the point. Medieval medicine was a dark joke, but a joke people had to laugh through, or, well, not, depending on how much humor they had left after being treated. But hey, at least it wasn't boring, right? So the next time you get a prescription for antibiotics or make a trip to the doctor for a cold, just thank the stars that we're not in the same situation the peasants found themselves in during the Middle Ages. And definitely don't ask your barber to take out your appendix. Let's start with one of the most successful medieval medical practices: bloodletting. Now, if you were lucky enough to catch an illness in the Middle Ages, you could expect your doctor to suggest one of their tried and true methods, draining some of your blood. The reasoning behind this was that sickness was caused by an imbalance in the humors, the body's vital fluids, like blood and bile. The solution? Let's just take a few pints of your blood, and voila, problem solved. No worries if you're feeling a little lightheaded afterward. Just lie down, rest, and try not to die. Doctors would either use a sharp instrument to open a vein, or let leeches do the dirty work. Yes, leeches. Because if you're going to go through something invasive and painful, why not throw in a few slimy creatures to make the experience a bit more memorable? It's like if you went to a modern spa for a nice massage and instead of using essential oils, they asked you to sit in a pool of mosquitoes. Same concept, right? Well, medieval doctors would argue that leeches help balance your humors by sucking out your bad blood. Sure, the cure might have left you weaker and possibly with an infection, but at least you weren't sick anymore, right? Honestly, bloodletting was like medieval spa therapy. If your spa included a high likelihood of fainting, infection, and even death. I mean, if you've ever felt lightheaded after giving blood at a modern clinic, imagine what it would have been like in a 14th century dungeon with no antiseptic, a rusty blade, and a doctor who probably just learned the trick of it yesterday. You might have left with less blood, but you'd certainly leave with a whole new appreciation for modern medicine. And the funny thing is, this wasn't just something you'd try once. No, medieval doctors loved bloodletting. It was practically their go-to treatment for everything. Cough? Bloodletting? Fever? Bloodletting? Plague? Well, why not? If a little blood is good, surely a lot of blood would do the trick, right? In fact, many people were subjected to multiple rounds of bloodletting. A person could get bled dry and, depending on how much was taken out, still be sent back to their homes with a smile and a sense of accomplishment from their doctor. Too bad they'd probably be bedridden and weak for weeks afterward. But hey, at least the humor was balanced. Then, there were the herbal remedies, which were often more harmful than helpful. Medieval doctors, for some inexplicable reason, thought they could cure just about anything with a mix of herbs, roots, and sometimes toxic substances. Now, it's true that some herbs like garlic, ginger, and chamomile have legitimate healing properties. But, as any medieval doctor will tell you, why stick with something safe when you can throw in poisonous mushrooms and deadly nightshade? They didn't exactly have a thorough understanding of what could kill you and what could help you, so, well, they threw it all together and hoped for the best. They often made concoctions of mercury, arsenic, and other materials that, when ingested, would likely lead to immediate poisoning. Oh, you've got the plague? Don't worry, just drink some mercury and that'll cure you. Yes, truly. The magic was in the madness. Maybe medieval doctors thought poisoning you was part of the healing process. You've got the plague? Oh, don't worry. A little mercury will set things right. Maybe. There was also the beloved remedy of teething. Oh, the joy of being a baby in medieval times. Instead of a soothing rubber teething ring, infants were often given teething necklaces, which were often made from materials like amber, coral, or garlic. Sure, they didn't know about germs, but they did know that the harder, the better. Let's just put a chunk of coral around the baby's neck and hope that the bad spirits go away. And speaking of bad spirits, another common remedy for illness was spiritual intervention. If the herbs didn't work and the leeches didn't help, you might find yourself being blessed by a priest or even subjected to a good old-fashioned exorcism. Yes, if you were sick, there was a chance that, in addition to your herbal treatment, you might be subjected to an exorcism, just in case the devil was somehow involved in your illness. After all, if you weren't feeling better after all that bloodletting, mercury, and mystical prayers, maybe a priest shouting in Latin and waving a cross at you would finally do the trick. So, while you might think that modern medicine has its flaws, just remember, medieval medicine was far worse. You could be bleeding from your doctor, poisoned by your medicine, or exorcised by a priest. And even if it didn't work, at least you could say that you tried everything. Imagine going to a medieval doctor, getting bled dry, fed some mercury, and sent home with a prayer. How's that for healthcare? At least today, when we go to the doctor, we're guaranteed a bit of understanding and a good shot of antibiotics instead of a leech-filled bloodletting. Medieval medicine wasn't all just bad decisions and expired herbs, though it often felt like it. Sometimes, things got even weirder, if that's even possible. Alongside the herbal concoctions, leech-filled bloodletting, and death-defying potions, people were encouraged to treat their ailments with magical remedies. That's right, magic. If the local herb didn't work, or if the doctor's trusty leech collection wasn't quite up to the task, you might be advised to simply pray to a saint or carry around a lucky charm. After all, what's modern medicine without a touch of magic, right? Many people firmly believe that wearing a lucky amulet or reciting a spell would cure everything from a toothache to the plague. A little chant here, a charm there, and maybe a bit of divine intervention thrown in for good measure. And boom, your sickness was gone. Take, for example, the lucky rat's foot. If you were a peasant in need of a remedy, and let's face it, you probably were, you might be told that carrying a rat's foot around your neck would ward off bad health. If you were fortunate enough to be able to afford something even fancier, maybe you could get a saint's relic, that's right, a bone from a saint's body thought to work wonders in curing the sick. Sure, it wasn't modern medicine, but who's to say what works when you're really desperate, right? Who needs antibiotics when you've got saint-approved incantations and a rat's foot? Makes you wonder if the medieval doctors were secretly running a scam. Here, pay me a gold coin, and I'll give you a handful of sage and this blessed ribbon. You'll be cured. Probably. Now, you might be thinking, wait, weren't they doing the best they could with the limited knowledge they had? Maybe, but let's not sugarcoat it, these treatments were seriously lacking. But back then, if you couldn't get a proper doctor's advice, at least you had your local apothecary, or even your neighbor who swore by that rat's foot they'd been wearing for years. And hey, who could blame them for trying, right? With sickness sweeping through villages, what else were you gonna do? If it wasn't a leech, it was an incantation. But wait, there's more. If the luck of a rat's foot didn't do the trick, there was always the ever-popular superstition that illness was caused by evil spirits, the evil eye, or of course demons. That's right, demons. If you were feeling under the weather, it was likely you had some kind of malicious, invisible creature hanging around. This belief led many people to resort to some of the most creative medical treatments you can imagine. It wasn't uncommon for a priest to be called in to perform an exorcism or sprinkle you with holy water. You could be sure that if your body was aching, your soul wasn't too far behind. What was more reassuring than a medieval doctor telling you that your sickness wasn't from the flu, it was from a demon? But hey, there were no shortage of solutions for that. No need for over-the-counter meds when you had holy water on hand. Superstitions played an even bigger role in medieval medicine than you might expect. You had things like carrying around a lucky coin, a crystal, or even a piece of crossed wood to protect you from evil forces. Then, there were those colorful, heavily embroidered charms that you could hang around your neck, embroidered by witches, or wise women, as they were sometimes called, in the dead of night. Nothing says confidence like a magical piece of cloth that's guaranteed to make you feel better, even if you did get it from a wandering old woman with questionable ethics. To get rid of that pesky evil spirit, the general solution would be a mix of prayer and a few charms tucked into your pocket. If that didn't work, well, at least there was always the comfort of a priest wielding holy water like it was a magic wand, splashing it on everything, hoping to remove the spirits, or at least make you feel a little less miserable. If only you could just go to the pharmacy and buy a bottle of demon-off spray, right? And if you didn't have the luxury of holy water or a praying priest at hand, you could always turn to the rune stones. Yes, rune stones. A kind of magical script carved into stones that were believed to carry divine protection. Forget the medications modern doctors prescribed for anxiety back then. You'd carve runes on a stone and keep them under your pillow for a peaceful night's sleep. If that didn't work, perhaps a lucky stone or some crystal pendants from a wandering merchant would do the trick. This era's medicine was clearly all over the place, mixing a healthy dose of magic, superstition, and a generous sprinkle of divine intervention. The fascinating part, though, is how it reveals how people back then dealt with uncertainty, discomfort, and disease. It wasn't just about applying remedies. It was about the belief that they could be cured, and that in itself became a major part of the treatment. At its core, medieval medicine and remedies were often more about faith than fact. People didn't have the luxury of modern medicine, nor the means to understand bacteria, viruses, or germs. Instead, they turned to what they knew: magic, charms, and prayers. Things that, even today, offer comfort when modern science doesn't give us the answers we want. Sure, the rat's foot didn't do much to cure the plague, but it sure as hell made you feel like you had some control over your own fate. And maybe that's one of the most powerful elements of these medieval treatments: a sense of hope. In the face of so many illnesses, so much danger, and such little understanding of the human body, people grasped for whatever they could find. It wasn't pretty, but at least they had something to hold on to. Medieval doctors may have been a mix of herbalists, priests, and possibly a few wandering quacks who figured that they could treat anything from a cough to the plague, but they did their best with the limited resources at hand. And sure, a little rat's foot or holy water might not have cured much, but it at least gave people a reason to keep fighting, keep hoping, and, most importantly, keep believing that there was some kind of answer to their suffering. Back then, medicine was like a game of chance, but at least they got a nice little charm out of it, right? Now, if you thought medieval medicine was rough with its potions, leeches, and magical charms, we have to talk about surgery. Because what's more comforting than the idea of a surgeon wielding a rusty saw with no anesthesia, no sterilization, and best of all, no real understanding of how to operate on the human body? Sure, they might have been able to set a broken bone with some degree of competence, maybe, but when it came to anything more complex, well, let's just say quick wasn't exactly what they were going for. For example, if you needed a tooth pulled in the medieval era, it was going to be one of two options. Either you could try to tough it out until the pain was unbearable, or you could visit the local barber surgeon. That's right, back then, the same person who cut your hair might also be pulling your teeth and, for a little extra coin, possibly attempting to treat your ailment with a mix of whiskey and witchcraft. After all, why let someone with a degree handle it when a person with a razor-sharp razor and a bit of free time could do the job just as well, right? Now I know what you're thinking. Surgery without anesthesia? Surely there had to be some kind of numbing agent. Well, here's where it gets fun. While there was no anesthesia, not even the luxury of smelling salts to knock you out, they did have methods to distract you. And by distract, I mean they might have given you a nice big swig of alcohol to drink while they hacked away at your body. That's right, drink up. And then enjoy the unforgettable experience of watching someone operate on you while you were, hopefully, somewhat tipsy. Imagine lying down on a makeshift operating table with your leg about to be chopped off, and the doctor just smiles at you, pats your shoulder, and says, "Don't worry, it's just going to be a quick one." But here's the kicker. This quick procedure might have taken hours, and there were no antibiotics to stave off infections. So, once that limb was gone, the battle didn't end there. You could be staring down the possibility of an infection that could take you out in a way that was far more painful than losing your leg in the first place. I can't imagine anyone looking forward to that kind of treatment. A medieval dentist probably got more business than he wanted. "Hey, I know your tooth hurts, but I've got a great offer on the quick extraction technique. It involves no numbing, just a lot of yelling." Of course, this wasn't just for your average tooth extraction. If you needed something serious, like a limb amputated, you'd be subjected to a procedure that would make modern-day surgery seem like a gentle spa treatment. First, they'd probably slap some alcohol in your face, maybe tell you to take a deep breath, and then, without so much as a "let me know if this hurts," they'd go to work, often with a rusty saw, and not much more than brute force. And don't even get me started on bloodletting at the same time. If they didn't have leeches handy, and let's face it, they probably did, they'd just grab a sharp knife and cut you open, hoping to release just enough blood to balance the humors. But no pressure, right? The last thing you'd want is to pass out from the pain before they were able to finish. Let's also consider the fact that these early surgeons weren't trained professionals. There were no fancy medical schools, no great institutions teaching anatomy. They probably barely knew where the brain was, let alone how to fix it. No, instead, they often learned by trial and error, which, let's be honest, doesn't always end well for the patient. The idea of surgery was a game of roulette. You might survive, you might not. But either way, you were going to get a lot of drama. And yes, that meant infections were basically a given. How did they deal with infections back then? With more bloodletting, more alcohol, and maybe a bit of healing sage rubbed into the wound for good measure. It's a wonder people managed to survive at all. But hey, this was the 14th century. And if you didn't go into surgery with a death wish, you certainly came out with one. Not to mention, the best part was that if they did somehow manage to save your life, you could look forward to a nice round of bed rest while trying to avoid infection, which was an absolute delight when all you had for medical attention was a couple of cloth rags, a prayer, and a lot of luck. Modern-day surgery as we know it is practically spa-level luxury compared to what medieval patients went through. I mean, no one's forcing you to wear a metal helmet to help you sleep through surgery today, right? And let's not forget, if you survived that surgery, you were considered an exception. You'd probably be talking about that time you nearly lost a limb with your friends at the tavern, laughing about it as you shared a tankard of beer with a healthy, fully intact arm. It's safe to say medieval surgery was about as refined as a backyard barbecue. If you made it through, you were a survivor. If you didn't, well, let's hope you didn't need that limb in the afterlife. Religion played a huge role in medieval healthcare. Priests were often seen as the ultimate healers, sometimes more trusted than doctors. Miraculous relics and holy waters were used to cure illness, and even the church itself believed in a divine connection between health and faith. If you were sick, it might be your penance for a sin, so the solution was often a good old confession and some church-approved incense. For many, being ill wasn't just a physical problem, it was a spiritual one. Coughing up your soul's sins while hacking up a lung was considered a 2-for-1 deal. So why not solve it by just going to confession and hoping for the best? The church's role as a spiritual health center can't be overstated. You weren't just treated for what was happening to your body, but for what was happening to your soul. And while medical knowledge was still, let's say, in its infancy, the priests were often seen as more knowledgeable, not just in theology, but in health. A priest with a few holy relics on hand was like a medieval doctor with a prescription pad. The most trusted physicians were the ones who could also bless your ailments. After all, why settle for a basic fever remedy when you could get a blessed amulet and a prayer to Saint So-and-so, guaranteed to rid you of your demons? or at least your fever. Sometimes, all you needed was a little divine intervention and a dash of holy water. The catch? The holy water didn't have a refund policy. It's not like medieval doctors didn't try, though. They just didn't have the science we have today. Instead, they looked for answers in the divine. And if the priest didn't work, well, there was always the local saint. Relics were also a big part of medieval medicine. Imagine going to a shrine only to find out that your best hope for a cure isn't some clever remedy or actual medical knowledge, but a bone of a saint or a rock that's blessed by divine forces. Sounds like a deal, right? You'd walk into a church, and rather than a physician offering you a proper treatment, you'd get the option to touch a holy relic, which was believed to transfer divine healing power directly into you. You could walk in with the plague and leave with a blessed prayer cloth and some seriously high hopes. It wasn't just about health, it was about your place in the afterlife too. After all, you might be physically ill, but you sure didn't want to get the eternal flu because you didn't say enough Hail Marys. Now, these relics weren't just for show. They were sacred objects meant to cure and protect. If you were lucky enough to have the right relic, your chances of a quick recovery were supposedly much higher. People traveled from far and wide to visit shrines and holy sites. It wasn't about diagnosis or scientific principles. It was about faith. And if you didn't feel better after seeing the saint's finger bone, well, at least you could try the next saint over. Honestly, at this point, the medieval medical field was a bit like the pharmacy section at the medieval equivalent of CVS. Just throw everything at the problem and hope something sticks. Who needs antibiotics when you've got saint-approved incantations and a rat's foot? Makes you wonder if the medieval doctors were secretly running a scam. Here, pay me a gold coin, and I'll give you a handful of sage and this blessed ribbon. You'll be cured. Probably. Alongside actual remedies, you had superstitions. Illness was often thought to be caused by demons, the evil eye, or bad spirits, and the solution was usually to have a priest perform an exorcism, or even more likely, sprinkle you with holy water. If only you could just go to the pharmacy and buy a bottle of demon-off spray, right? But no. Instead, you got holy water, or a spiritual cleansing to go along with your fevered symptoms. The more you think about it, the more it's like medieval medicine was just a mixed bag of prayers, potions, and some questionable advice. If you weren't feeling well, the first thing to do wasn't rest. It was to get down on your knees and pray. A priest's blessing was believed to be as potent as any medicinal remedy. And while no one actually knew what was making you sick, except that God was punishing you for something, probably, the solution was always the same: prayer, incense, and maybe a couple of holy relics. Forget the thermometer or the stethoscope. Let's just hope St. George is in a good mood today. Honestly, if there's a silver lining, it's that the church didn't charge for these miracles. Instead of paying a bill, you could give a small offering, say a prayer, and call it a day. Imagine going to the doctor today and hearing, "Oh, you've got a cold? That's a tough one. But don't worry, I'll say a prayer to St. Jude. If that doesn't work, I'll toss in a blessed salt shaker and some holy vinegar, maybe a pinch of holy water to wash down the saint's tooth." Yeah, modern medicine's definitely come a long way, hasn't it? Despite its lack of hygiene and rather questionable practices, medieval medicine did have an impact. For all its faults, it laid the foundations for the medical systems we use today, though perhaps not in the ways medieval doctors would have hoped. Modern hospitals, with their sterile walls and patient charts, can trace their origins back to the makeshift infirmaries of medieval times. The concept of having a dedicated space to treat the sick wasn't fully realized until centuries later, but the groundwork for public health systems was laid down during these troubled times. Hospitals began to emerge during the medieval period, but they weren't what you would think of today. These early hospitals were often run by religious orders and were more about providing shelter and food to the sick rather than actual medical treatment. There was a touch of divine intervention mixed into the treatment. After all, praying for a cure was just as important as any herbal concoction. Yet, these early institutions were still necessary. They offered a place for the ill to rest, receive care, and maybe catch a whiff of some incense while they waited to see if divine intervention would kick in. But perhaps the most significant step that medieval medicine gave us was the documentation of symptoms and illnesses. While these diagnoses were wildly inaccurate, they did mark a shift in how the human body was observed and studied. Medieval doctors started to recognize patterns and symptoms, even if they misinterpreted what was actually going on. Fever? That was probably a sign of an imbalance in humors or a punishment from God. But at least they started paying attention to what people were actually suffering from. And that's where it all began. They might not have known about germs or bacteria, but they knew when people were suffering from similar symptoms and diseases. Slowly, they began categorizing ailments and figuring out how to treat them, even if those treatments often involved a little bloodletting or a hefty dose of leeches. Fast forward a few centuries, and these early methods of documenting illnesses evolved into the field of diagnosis as we know it today. In fact, some historians argue that the medieval period, though a time of great ignorance and suffering, helped establish the framework for modern medicine by focusing on observation and categorization. It's a bit like that embarrassing period where we all wore questionable fashion choices as teenagers, but somehow it eventually led to the sophisticated sense of style we have now. It's messy, but there's progress. Let's not forget the role of medieval universities, which began popping up in the late Middle Ages. While they weren't exactly the bright, shiny institutions of knowledge we know today, they did lay the groundwork for modern medical education. Scholars, often clergy members, began to teach medical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, which, as you can imagine, were more mystical than scientific. And though these texts weren't necessarily up to modern standards, they encouraged a more systematic approach to the study of health. There were books on anatomy, herbal remedies, and even some wild theories on how the stars could influence health. Because, of course, why would the health of a person not be related to where Jupiter was in the sky? These early medical schools and universities were pivotal in spreading the idea of a formal education for doctors. It was also in the Middle Ages that we saw the first inklings of medical ethics, even if they were rather loosely defined. Some medieval texts even began to address the issue of patient consent, though I'm sure informed consent in the 12th century probably meant, do you agree to take this potion made from who knows what? It was a beginning, however vague, that eventually led to the Hippocratic Oath and modern medical ethics. So, there was some evolution happening, just not the kind that would win any awards for precision or common sense. But wait, there's more. As the centuries went on, and with the eventual rise of more scientific methods in the Renaissance, medieval practices started to get a major overhaul. For instance, the shift from bloodletting to more humane treatments didn't happen overnight, but when it did, it was a pretty big deal. New discoveries in biology and medicine, many of which came from brilliant minds who probably thought, hey, let's stop guessing and start experimenting, began to push medieval practices into the realm of the ridiculous. While medieval doctors may have based their treatments on divine intervention, Renaissance scientists and doctors began relying on observation, experimentation, and reasoning to understand the human body. It was a slow process, and we're talking centuries here, but you can see the progression toward the medicine we practice today. As for those medieval doctors, well, their legacy isn't entirely lost. If you've ever walked into a modern hospital and thought, wow, it sure smells nice in here, you've got medieval medicine to thank for that. Hospitals eventually became more focused on cleanliness and patient care. But let's face it, without the medieval period's messy but somewhat sincere attempts at caring for the sick, modern medicine might have taken even longer to get its start. So, next time you get an MRI scan, just remember, it all started with a holy water bath and a good rat's foot amulet. Thank medieval medicine for giving us a starting point, minus all the creepy snake oils and prayers. As we move into the Renaissance and beyond, things started to get, well, a little more rational. We could even thank the Renaissance for some of the early pushbacks against medieval practices like bloodletting. However, these later periods didn't completely rid the medical world of all the oddities we've mentioned today. For example, the infamous medical quacks continued to flourish well into the 18th century, still convincing people that their magical potions could cure the plague, though they might also end up killing you faster. It was clear, while medieval medicine might have laid down the foundation for modern health systems, it took centuries of trial, error, and a bit of insanity before we figured out how to keep people alive with anything more reliable than a good prayer and a rat's foot. And even today, with all our high-tech equipment and science-backed medicine, a part of us still clings to that old-world charm, the belief that if you throw enough potions and prayers at a problem, something might just work. And that's the fascinating, messy, slightly terrifying legacy of medieval medicine. It wasn't all bad, though. Some medieval remedies were surprisingly effective, though mostly by accident. But for the most part, the medieval world was just trying its best with the limited knowledge it had. After all, no one really understood how germs worked back then. And let's face it, neither did many medieval doctors. But slowly, we moved forward, from trial and error to systematic study. And that's what eventually gave us the world of modern medicine that we know today. So, next time you sit in a doctor's office, relax. You may have had a blood test, but you're not going to be bled dry or given a magical remedy. You're light years away from the world where leeches and leech-hugging physicians ruled the day. And we can thank the early, bumbling, often weird but sometimes genius medieval practitioners for that. Despite the medieval medicine debacle, there was one thing they did get somewhat right: the idea of creating dedicated spaces to treat the sick. In the 12th and 13th centuries, monasteries were the first places where people could actually go to receive care. These early hospitals weren't quite like the sterile places we know today. These were more like a place where you could lay down and pray for a miracle. But hey, at least it was a step up from being bled out in your own home. It's funny to think about how hospitals, one of the pillars of modern public health, started out. We've come a long way from those humble beginnings. Thankfully, modern hospitals have moved past the pray and hope method of care. Back in the day, if you were sick, you'd be lucky if you got a little rest and a blessing from the monks. The true goal was not so much to treat you like an actual patient, but to help you get closer to heaven whether you liked it or not. While monks weren't exactly trained physicians, unless you count divine intervention as a skill, they did serve as the first form of institutionalized care, even if it was more about salvation than science. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but if you were a peasant dying of a fever, would you rather be at home with leeches or at a monastery hoping a prayer and some bread would do the trick? It's a toss-up, really. Even though these early hospitals weren't cutting edge in terms of medical care, they marked a monumental shift in thinking. Before the idea of hospitals took hold, sick people were largely confined to their homes where they were cared for by family members, or by a quack who maybe knew some useful herb, but mostly just had a lot of confidence. The idea that a sick person could be taken to a dedicated space where someone might at least try to help was a massive leap forward. Sure, there wasn't much help being offered, but the gesture alone was enough to plant the seeds for what would eventually evolve into the hospitals we know today. Of course, as time went on, hospitals slowly began to take shape. They weren't pretty, and they weren't exactly filled with knowledgeable doctors, but they were there. And slowly, the idea that people could be treated in a specific place for illness caught on. It was a little messy, of course. Probably a lot of dead bodies and rats mixed in with the healing. But it was a start. As the centuries passed, more and more hospitals were established. They were still a far cry from the sterile environments we're used to, but they were beginning to take on a more recognizable shape. These hospitals were often associated with religious orders, so a fair amount of their care was probably closer to spiritual guidance than actual medical attention. But at least the sick weren't just sent home to die. They were taken in, given a bed, though maybe not a clean one, and offered some comfort in their final days. Comfort that sometimes came in the form of a prayer and a cup of herbal tea that could either cure you or send you on a trip to the afterlife faster than you'd planned. The growth of early hospitals wasn't exactly a clean, linear process. Hospitals were often chaotic places where disease spread as quickly as the prayers, and the medical knowledge was patchy at best. But despite the disorganization, something important was happening. People were beginning to understand that disease and illness were not just punishments from God, but things that could be treated in a more systematic way. Slowly but surely, this mindset would spread, leading to the development of better public health systems in the centuries to come. So, next time you're in a hospital with a nice bed, nurses, and technology that doesn't involve boiling herbs, just remember, it all started with monks, rats, and some questionable herbal remedies. You could be in a much worse place. It's easy to forget how much we take for granted today when it comes to healthcare. We complain about long wait times or a doctor who doesn't spend enough time with us. But imagine a time when the best you could get was a prayer and a hope that maybe, just maybe, the disease would go away on its own. Hospitals might have started as dark, dingy places filled with disease, but they were the foundation upon which the world of medicine would one day thrive. Hospitals became an essential part of the medieval landscape, but they weren't just places of healing. They were also places where people went to die. With limited medical knowledge and a high rate of mortality, it wasn't uncommon for hospitals to be filled with patients who were beyond help. In fact, many medieval hospitals became overcrowded deathbeds, where the only treatment available was comfort in your final moments. But even death had a certain spiritual significance, and many of the patients who died in these hospitals were given a proper last rites ceremony before they passed. After all, the church wasn't just there to save you, it was there to help you die in the best possible way, with a clear conscience. The role of the church in these early hospitals cannot be overstated. They weren't just centers for care, they were hubs of spiritual activity. Many hospitals were connected to monasteries or convents, where monks and nuns would both care for the sick and pray for their souls. This blending of care and spirituality was a defining feature of medieval hospitals, and it wasn't until the Renaissance that medicine started to separate itself from religion. But even during the Renaissance, religious hospitals continued to play a key role in healthcare. So, what's the takeaway here? While medieval hospitals might not have saved lives in the way we imagine today, they represented a significant step in the evolution of healthcare. From humble beginnings in monasteries to the grand institutions we know now, hospitals have come a long way. But without the early experiments and ideas, we might still be trying to fix broken limbs with a hammer and a prayer. As for those medieval doctors, they may not have been perfect, but they were part of a larger, ongoing effort to understand disease and how to treat it. They might not have had the technology or knowledge we take for granted today, but they were laying the groundwork for a more systematic, scientific approach to healthcare. It might have taken centuries to get from there to here, but those early efforts set the stage for the medicine we know today. So, next time you're in a modern hospital and you get frustrated with the wait, remember the people who first came up with the idea of a hospital. They didn't have clean needles or high-tech diagnostic equipment. They didn't even have basic hygiene, but they did have a lot of hope and a whole lot of prayers. And in their own way, they helped pave the way for the medical advances we benefit from today. Let's take a moment to appreciate the journey of medical science, from the humble beginnings of medieval medicine to the cutting-edge technology of modern healthcare. Sure, it's been a messy journey, but it's one that's led to the incredible advancements we see now. And the next time you get a prescription or go for a checkup, you can at least rest easy knowing your doctor isn't going to give you a dose of mercury or try to cure your headache with a leech. It's been a long road, but we finally made it out of the medieval. Here's where things get really wild. In the medieval world, when people got sick, there was no shortage of explanations. And if you were a woman with a bit of knowledge about herbs and potions, congratulations. You might have just earned yourself a one-way ticket to being accused of witchcraft. People were so superstitious that if you could heal a wound with a herb, it was just as likely someone would think you were cursing them as healing them. After all, what's more suspicious than someone knowing the secret to making a mean poultice or curing a cough with a little rosemary and thyme? It wasn't unusual for a healer, especially one who was a woman, to be suspected of using magic when they'd simply mastered a few practical skills. Imagine, for example, a woman in a small village offering a helpful remedy for a nasty cold. Instead of getting a thank you, she could end up tied to a post, accused of being a witch, and facing public humiliation or worse. The line between healer and witch was as blurry as the medieval understanding of anatomy, and both were equally feared. I mean, honestly, if the medieval doctor didn't have a leech or a prayer handy, they could just toss you in a lake and call it a day. No healing required, just trial by water. Because who doesn't love some medieval justice? Floating meant you were innocent. Sinking meant, well, you probably didn't need any medicine after all, did you? In those times, any woman who could handle a few herbs or had a reputation for curing the sick was automatically suspect. If the illness didn't get better after their treatment, it was considered proof of their witchcraft. A bad harvest? Witchcraft. A fever that didn't break? Witchcraft. And suddenly, a healer who once saved lives now found herself being dragged through the streets by an angry mob. A cure for a fever? Witchcraft. The entire town might turn on you, no matter how many people you helped. After all, it was easier to blame your neighbor for being a witch than to admit you had no idea how to cure something. During the 15th century, witch hunts became a thing. Anyone with the slightest suspicion of practicing any kind of alternative medicine, especially if you were a woman, could be branded a witch. The result? A lot of herbalists and midwives were persecuted, often with tragic consequences. And in a world where medicine was literally a guessing game, the people that were getting punished were often the ones who knew the most. This was the era of witch trials, a time when medical ignorance met mass hysteria. If someone could cure a sick child, they could easily be accused of witchcraft. In fact, it didn't matter if you were curing the illness or accidentally making it worse. Either way, someone would eventually point a finger at you and shout, "Witch." Once the accusation was made, there was little to do but run for your life, or worse, face public trial and execution. Many innocent healers, who had simply learned from generations of women passing down remedies, were killed because of these accusations. This unfortunate reality meant that the most skilled healers and midwives, those who knew the most about plants and potions, were often the first ones to go when suspicion was in the air. Nothing says healer like being dunked in a river and hoping you don't drown. Medieval medicine, where witch hunts and witch cures were one and the same. If you survive the water, great. You're innocent. But if you sink, well, don't worry. You won't need a second dose of medicine. During the witch hunts, women were especially targeted, as they were the primary caregivers and often the ones who passed down knowledge of healing remedies. The very skills that helped them earn a place in their communities led to their undoing. And because there wasn't exactly a medical textbook to turn to, a bad outcome could quickly spiral into an accusation of witchcraft. The whole concept of diagnosis was a lot of guesswork, and with the absence of effective treatments, it was far easier to accuse someone of using dark magic than to understand that maybe, just maybe, the treatment didn't work because there was no proper understanding of germs or medicine. Witchcraft accusations weren't just a problem in small villages either. Even within towns and cities, the fear of witches spread like wildfire, often fueled by religious authorities. The church, which had a tight grip on both spiritual and earthly matters, was quick to step in when accusations were made. With the church's blessing, people felt justified in seeking retribution. And soon enough, the hunt for witches spread beyond rural communities and into urban centers, leading to horrific witch trials. And in many cases, those accused were often marginalized women, widows, healers, or just women who weren't afraid to speak out. You know, it's strange to think that medieval people were so terrified of witchcraft and yet didn't hesitate to take a bit of leech juice or use a pinch of mercury when it suited them. Maybe the witch trials were just a way to distract from the fact that everyone was still terrified of a cough that didn't go away. In the grand scheme of things, it's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Imagine this. Someone is accused of witchcraft for healing the sick, only to be executed in a public spectacle. Meanwhile, the local apothecary is selling toxic mercury with no accountability, and everyone's just going about their day. At the time, a witch was often anyone who knew a little too much about plants, herbs, or folk medicine. A bad crop? A mysterious illness? Why not blame the local healer for being in league with Satan? And in a world where proper medical knowledge was scarce, this kind of scapegoating was all too common. To sum it up, medieval medicine was a mix of poor science, good intentions, and bad superstitions. When a plague hit, it wasn't uncommon for people to turn to prayer, potions, or worse, trial by water. Women with knowledge of healing became targets of mass hysteria, and in a world filled with fear and uncertainty, witch hunts were seen as a quick and easy solution to problems that were simply beyond understanding. So, the next time someone suggests you try an ancient remedy or tells you that a spell might cure what ails you, just remember, you're not just dealing with bad science. You're flirting with the rich, ridiculous history of medicine. And who knows, maybe it'll be a bit of magic that finally helps you get through your cold. Though, honestly, it might just be the modern medicine you're ignoring in favor of superstition. After all, The medieval folks might have been obsessed with supernatural cures, but at least they didn't have to suffer through the horror of a hospital waiting room, right? Despite the horrific practices and tragic outcomes, medieval medicine laid the groundwork for modern healthcare. Many early physicians started keeping records, documenting symptoms, and trying to classify diseases. It wasn't all effective. Most of it was pure guesswork, but the idea of diagnosing and treating illness based on observed symptoms and patterns was born in those dark ages. At the time, no one had any idea that germs were a thing. If you caught a cold, they didn't think it was a virus. They thought it was either a punishment from God or the result of too much bad air. Still, these early attempts at record keeping and documentation paved the way for modern medicine's focus on studying symptoms and trying to understand how diseases spread. The medieval doctors were essentially the first ones to observe and record what we would later come to call symptoms and conditions. Sure, they didn't know what they were talking about half the time, but they wrote it down anyway. They'd note, patient has fever, and then proceed to give them a cocktail of mercury, leeches, and a prayer. But even if the remedies weren't great, the idea of looking at symptoms and trying to make sense of them, well, that was a giant leap forward. If they had just kept track of what not to do, they'd have been on the right track a lot sooner. So, next time you get a prescription, remember, it all started with some monks writing down that a cold could kill you, and then deciding to bless you with holy water and a prayer. We've come a long way since then. But the roots are there. I mean, we may have upgraded to real medicine, but let's not forget that your antibiotic might owe its existence to a monk shaking a vial of holy potion and whispering a prayer for your survival. Cheers to progress, right? Yes, medieval doctors might have had questionable methods, but they helped set the foundation for our understanding of the human body. If you've ever taken an antibiotic or visited a hospital, take a moment to thank medieval monks and the clumsy but somewhat visionary doctors who started documenting symptoms. Sure, they may have had no idea about germs, but they were at least starting to think in the right direction. It's like the first step in a very long and confusing journey. They were guessing, sure, but sometimes their guesses weren't that far off. These early medieval healers, with their half-baked theories and crude methods, were, in some ways, trying to build a framework for something much larger. They might not have known about viruses or bacteria, but their focus on documenting symptoms and trying to treat ailments based on those symptoms was an important start. This was the beginning of what would eventually lead to the scientific study of disease. In a way, they were the pioneers, except instead of using a microscope, they used a prayer book and maybe a chicken's liver to diagnose you. Every time you get a flu shot, just remember, the monks that invented medieval flu shots probably just slapped you with a wet cloth and prayed you wouldn't die. But hey, the thought counts. I guess. If you survived the cold, you'd get a nice pat on the back and maybe a boiled onion or two for your troubles. We've certainly come a long way from those medieval vaccinations. These early medical records, while crude and often bordering on ridiculous, eventually contributed to the foundations of modern diagnosis. They started the process of systematically observing and categorizing illness, even if they didn't fully understand what they were looking at. They kept track of recurring symptoms, and though they didn't understand what was causing them, they were able to notice patterns. And without this early attempt at diagnosis, we wouldn't have had the necessary foundation for modern practices like the study of epidemiology or even the basics of sanitation. So, yes, medieval doctors were far from the miracle workers we now expect from our modern-day physicians. But they were also far from the quacks and charlatans we sometimes think they were. In fact, a lot of medieval medical knowledge was based on a genuine effort to make sense of the world. While their methods were ineffective or outright harmful in many cases, their approach writing down symptoms, documenting diseases, and trying to make connections set the stage for better things to come. In a way, medieval medicine was like the first draft of a textbook on human health. It was messy, it was poorly researched, and it was full of errors. But it was a starting point. And from those humble beginnings, we eventually got the incredibly advanced and far more effective medical systems we have today. So next time you get a prescription or have a visit to the hospital, just take a moment to reflect on the fact that medieval people were out there using leeches to cure your cold and giving you mercury to treat your fever. And despite all that, we managed to move from that to modern hospitals, antiseptics, and vaccines. And hey, I'd much rather be given a prescription than a handful of mercury any day. Next time you get that shiny new antibiotic, just thank the medieval folks for setting the groundwork, and maybe say a little thanks to the monks who somehow got the idea of keeping records of diseases. Even if their idea of treatment involved chanting, holy water, and the occasional rat's foot, medieval medicine's legacy isn't just about the bad practices and failed treatments. It's also about how the early attempts at understanding disease paved the way for what we now know about medicine. It was a process of trial and error, of figuring things out through a combination of luck, superstition, and the occasional bit of practical knowledge. But without those early missteps, we wouldn't have the healthcare systems we rely on today. Modern medicine owes a lot to the past, even if we look back and cringe at some of the methods used. In the end, medieval medicine might not have known about germs, bacteria, or viruses, but they were trying. And, as much as we laugh at their methods now, the medical field we have today wouldn't be what it is without those early, often misguided, but important steps. So, here's to the medieval doctors, who definitely didn't know what they were doing, but got the ball rolling nonetheless. So, next time you feel the need to complain about your doctor's handwriting or a long wait in the ER, just imagine the days when your biggest health risk wasn't just the wait it was the fact that you might be prescribed some mercury and a cure-all chant. Medieval medicine might not have been pretty, but its legacy lives on in the science and knowledge we have today. It's a good reminder that sometimes, even the most bizarre and ridiculous practices can lead to something useful. Just ask modern medicine. It all started somewhere, and for better or worse, it started with a little bit of medieval chaos. Today, we've come a long way since the days of medieval medicine. We understand germ theory, we have antibiotics, and surgical procedures that don't involve rusty saws. But the history of medieval medicine isn't just a footnote. It's a reminder of how far we've come. And it also serves as a cautionary tale of what can happen when science and superstition blend together. After all, for every legitimate healer trying to figure things out, there were 50 others throwing in a bit of magic, guesswork, and sometimes a dash of rat poison just for good measure. Modern science has given us the power to actually understand the body and its workings. We now know that diseases are caused by microorganisms like bacteria and viruses, not by bad air or imbalance of humors. Imagine telling a medieval doctor that we now have tools that let us look inside your body without cutting you open. They'd probably start chanting some incantations to ward off evil spirits, and we'd all be in trouble. Honestly, after learning about medieval treatments, I'm thankful every day that the worst I have to deal with is a mild headache and a slightly over-enthusiastic pharmacist. At least when I'm feeling sick now, I get an actual diagnosis, not a bit of mercury and a prayer to St. Tertullian tossed in for good measure. Modern medicine is still evolving, but we no longer rely on leeches, prayers, or treatments like mercury to fix us. We've learned a lot, and our hospitals don't look like medieval dungeons anymore. Mostly, but we owe a lot of our advancements to the mistakes and successes of medieval doctors and healers. Yes, their methods may have been laughable and deadly, but their attempts laid the foundation for our modern healthcare system. Without them documenting symptoms, making observations, and trying things out even when they had no clue what they were doing, we wouldn't have been able to build on their knowledge. Medical knowledge, though rudimentary and often disastrous, led to the eventual establishment of hospitals, which began as places for the sick to go, however ill-equipped, and later became sites for research, diagnosis, and treatment. Medieval doctors, while misguided, contributed to this journey. They started the slow process of categorizing illnesses and treatments, an evolution that would eventually lead to the sophisticated system we now rely on. It's kind of like giving credit to the people who thought a wheel might help, but first had to deal with square ones and rocks. Next time you're sick, thank the stars you have a hospital and a prescription instead of just a handful of sage, a prayer, and a quick dip in holy water. At least now, when I visit the doctor, I don't leave feeling like I might be struck down by divine retribution or have my soul cleansed by a mix of toxic herbs. It's just a quick blood test and maybe a shot. Progress. Looking forward, modern medicine is still learning from the past. But thankfully, we have more data and fewer guesses. We're not throwing random concoctions of herbs or bodily fluids at patients. The rise of vaccines, the knowledge of antibiotics, the practice of sterile surgery, these are all the fruits of learning from mistakes that were made hundreds of years ago. Though medieval doctors didn't know about germs, their curiosity and attempts to categorize sicknesses made it possible for us to finally figure out what was going wrong in the first place. They just didn't have the tools, or in some cases the brain cells, to put it all together. But here's where it gets even better. Today's medical professionals have the advantage of thousands of years of improvement. We now understand that what medieval healers did wasn't just their best attempt at helping. It was a cultural and scientific dead end that could have easily sent us all spiraling into perpetual disease. Yet, through persistence and occasionally dumb luck, the evolution of healthcare has been relentless in its forward march. From the spooky, dusty corners of medieval medical rooms to the sterile, tech-driven environments of modern hospitals, we've made an astounding journey. So next time you're asked to do a full-body scan, think of the medieval guys who believed a good prayer, some wine, and a touch of garlic would have sorted out any fever you had. Don't forget to thank the heavens and modern medicine that you now have machines to tell you what's wrong, instead of just being given a blessed rat's foot and a pat on the head. We've also learned about the importance of preventive care, sanitation, and hygiene, things medieval doctors knew very little about. In fact, the idea of cleaning was often laughable to them, seeing as they didn't even know that washing hands could prevent disease transmission. Still, they did try to tackle issues like quarantine during times of plague, though their idea of a remedy was often as backward as their entire practice. But hey, at least the thought was there, sort of. The modern understanding of viruses, bacteria, and germs has allowed us to combat things that medieval people were simply powerless against. The medical profession may have started as a chaotic mix of guesswork, trial and error, and superstition, but the path paved by those medieval healers has led us to antibiotics, vaccines, and even things like organ transplants. Without those early, poorly informed efforts, the understanding of the human body wouldn't have come so far. The ridiculous and terrifying practices of medieval medicine, though horrifying in hindsight, show us the lengths that humanity has always been willing to go to in the pursuit of health. There's no doubt that these ancient remedies were more likely to make you worse than better, but each attempt was a step toward understanding what worked and what didn't. And sometimes, as we see with the unexpected success of some herbal remedies, what seemed like quackery was simply the start of a discovery we would later embrace. So, next time you're sitting in a doctor's office, waiting for that shiny prescription pad to appear, take a moment to think about the long road medicine has traveled. From prayers and potions to modern surgical suites, we've learned a lot. And we continue to learn every day, with each medical breakthrough paving the way for the next. What medieval doctors lacked in science, they made up for with curiosity. And in many ways, that laid the groundwork for what we know today. But let's just be glad we no longer rely on leeches for the common cold. So, let's take a minute and thank the medieval folks who invented medicine. You know, the ones who thought mercury was a good cure for anything. Without them, we might still be stuck with a good old dose of rat's foot and a prayer for our flu. Instead, we've got actual doctors, nurses, and technology that doesn't involve drinking mercury to get better. And that, dear listener, is where we'll wrap up our little journey through the world of medieval medicine. It was rough, it was crazy, and it was often deadly. But hey, it led us to where we are today. So here's to the weird, messy, and occasionally horrifying beginnings of modern healthcare, where medieval medicine was not just a mistake, but a necessary step in our long march toward better health. Here's to progress, and to the fact that you can now get an actual diagnosis that doesn't involve burning incense, wearing garlic necklaces, or being dunked in holy water. So, what have we learned today from the glorious world of medieval medicine? For one thing, we've come a long way, baby. We no longer rely on bloodletting, praying for miracles, or putting leeches on our faces, and thank goodness for that. But we also owe a bit of gratitude to the people of the Middle Ages who, despite their somewhat misguided efforts, helped lay the foundation for modern medicine. They tried. They really did. Without their persistence and occasional random guesswork, we wouldn't have been able to build upon what they started. Sure, their methods were often dangerous, often bizarre, but they didn't know better. They had no knowledge of germs, no fancy equipment, and no idea what an antibiotic even was. But they sure got creative with their solutions. And in a strange way, that's how progress works, even if it involves some seriously questionable practices. Next time you get a headache, just remember, in medieval times, your treatment could have involved mercury, bloodletting, or a prayer to Saint So-and-so. I think we've got it good now, don't you? At least you don't need to be dunked in holy water, wrapped in garlic, and have a leech stuck to your nose just to cure a cold. And if your doctor suggests leeches, well, maybe it's time to find a new one. Thanks for tuning in to this journey through medieval medicine. If you thought that was absurd, wait until we dive into more strange and hilarious moments from history. From ancient hygiene to peculiar cures, there's plenty more where that came from. Don't forget to subscribe, give us a like, and drop a comment if you're ever faced with a medieval doctor's office. Who knows, maybe next time you'll get a real treatment instead of a rat's foot and a prayer. Until next time, keep your health in check and maybe avoid any leeches or mercury-based remedies.